Okay, should be good.
All right. The topic for this year, the resolution, is that the United States federal government should substantially increase its economic engagement toward Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela. So all year long, people will be saying on the affirmative some version of this resolution. So generally choosing some form of economic engagement and choosing one of the countries as a case or an example of why that resolution would be true and claiming advantages off of that argument. And then on the negative, people will be saying that we should not, the USFG should not economically engage the chosen country either because either because that's not a good idea for some reason or because there's a better way of doing it or a variety of other reasons. So the way that this lecture, the order of things that will go on in this lecture, first we'll talk about what economic engagement means because it's a term with a lot of different possible applications. We'll talk about Latin America as a whole, which is sort of the chosen region of the resolution. But we'll just do that briefly because broader knowledge about Latin America is less helpful than knowing about the specific countries. So then we'll talk about the topic countries in alphabetical order, which also happens to be the order of likelihood of how many people will be making arguments about them. Cuba is probably going to be the largest topic country, Mexico second largest, and Venezuela probably not quite as much as the other countries. Then we'll talk about topic arguments, and so we'll start by talking about advantage ground on the affirmative this year, then talk about possible disads or reasons why the affirmative plan will cause some bad things, other ways to resolve the arguments presented by the affirmative, so counter plans, and then we'll talk briefly about some of the philosophical assumptions underlying the resolution or critical ground on the topic. So first, what is economic engagement? Economic engagement, broadly speaking by some of the more seasoned experts in the field, involves the cultivation of economic ties or a policy of, quote, deliberately expanding economic ties with an adversary in order to change the behavior of the target state. And the key part of that definition is not the adversarial part, but that there's some change that we wish to see in another country and another country's economy that we're going to change by cultivating particular economic ties or changing the way we do business with them. Haas and O'Sullivan have said that economic engagement consists of positive incentives as opposed to kind of negative actions. It is possible that economic engagement could include both, which we'll talk more about a little bit later. But positive incentives would mean, something sort of giving to the country or the target country's people a positive kind of economic boost or some action like aid that would be considered a positive incentive. Some of the questions that exist and are debated within the literature about what economic engagement involves are whether it would be conditional or unconditional, meaning that we would give it, unconditional would be just giving aid without attaching any requirements to it or giving some positive incentive without any requirements, whereas conditional would mean that there is some condition, something that we ask the target country to do in response. It seems most likely from the vast majority of the literature that it could be either, but so that some actions that include a requirement are considered to be economic engagement, but also without that, still economic engagement. There's also a question as to whether private actors can be involved or whether economic engagement exists solely within state-to-state actions or institutions within the state of the U.S. and of the target country. Here's a piece of evidence speaking to economic engagement. So we'll have some sort of cards throughout the lecture to illustrate some of the concepts that we're talking about. So economic engagement includes credits, investments, access to tech, loans, or aid. It includes removing embargoes or tariffs, but it is distinct from political, military, and civil society engagement. And this is Haas and O'Sullivan in 2000. Architects of engagement can choose from a wide variety of incentives. Economic engagement might offer a tangible incentive, such as export credits, investment, insurance or promotion, access to technology, loans or economic aid, investment insurance or, just said that. Other economic incentives involve the removal of penalties, such as trade embargoes, tariffs, which have impeded economic relations, facilitated entry into global economic arena. Political engagement can involve diplomatic recognition, access to institutions, scheduling of summits. Military engagement can involve the extension of training, and the key part about those two sentences is that they seem to distinguish political engagement or kind of diplomatic, interaction between the two, and military engagement using, military actors from economic engagement. So that is sort of a limiting piece of evidence. And then civil society engagement entails building people-to-people contacts, funding non-governmental organizations, facilitating the flow of remittances, and promoting the exchange of students, tourists, and other non-governmental people between countries are just some of the possible incentives used in this form of engagement. Some of the particular examples, so export credits involve support for exporters to a country, including direct credits to foreign buyers, refinancing or interest rate support, and cover or insurance for exports. So that means kind of generally underwriting exports to another country via some economic or financial kind of incentive. Who can tell me what it means to export? Yeah.
Basically ship goods to other countries.
Yeah, so to commercially can catch.
The thing's freaking out.
Good catch. It just like is not enjoying when I.
The plug's a little loose, right?
What?
The plug might be a little loose.
Oh, you think that's it? I'll try not to touch it. Okay, so when we send goods to another country, export credits involve the underwriting or the support for those exports. And then investment insurance means some form of financial cover for companies investing in a foreign country. So when we decide to invest in, the industry in another country, there would be some form of cover for if that investment doesn't work out. We would say, well, we still will, make sure that you get a return on your investment regardless of whether that happens. That's what investment insurance means. And then economic aid, giving another country support for their economy. This is maybe the broadest component of the resolution because, there's a lot of ways that you could support another country's economy. To say, like, well, if we, invest in this particular industry, that'll be great for their economy. If we say that reforms in their economic system will support their economy, those are all possible forms of economic of assistance for economic reform or for the growth of the economy. Investment promotion is sort of related to investment insurance. It's a way of promoting or incentivizing or suggesting that you should. Touching it seems to be worse.
Just put it on my laptop.
Do you mind?
I don't mind. Excuse me a second.
Well, I guess if I can get onto
That computer.
Yeah.
Okay.
It wasn't turning on for some reason. But
It might be not
So I think I'm pretty sure the last thing I said was investment promotion. So promoting, incentivizing, or otherwise supporting the investment in another country. The next one is access to technology, so allowing access to something like telecommunications technology that the U.S. has that the other country might not have or might not have in as advanced a form as they would like or as we would like them to have. The next is economic loans, not dissimilar from economic aid, but lending money to another country or to a particular organization within another country to facilitate some sort of project or investment, or otherwise just giving them money that we supposedly would get back. And then facilitating entry into evidence. So examples of international financial organizations include the WTO or the World Trade Organization. It's unclear if that particular subset of economic engagement is likely to be relevant, but it certainly is included under the umbrella of economic engagement. Here is a piece of evidence that sort of establishes the wide range of possible forms of economic engagement can take. So we looked at a more limited piece of evidence before this, which indicated that economic engagement is distinct from other forms like political or military engagement. This card suggests that it's actually quite broad. Economic engagement includes dialogue, assistance for economic reform, multilateral reform efforts, and working with NGOs. The Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism in 2009. The U.S. strategy of total economic engagement pursues economic reform, rule of law, and global economic integration. Total economic engagement includes regular bilateral discussions on topics with host government officials, formal structured dialogues, U.S. bilateral and multilateral assistance programs for economic reform. Programs are often complemented with technical assistance provided by specialized U.S. agencies, coordinated multilateral policies and assistance strategies to advance reform goals by working with international organizations, working with NGOs to advance reform issues. So as you can see, this is a broader piece of evidence in contrast to the card that said that things like technical or political or military engagement are distinct. This evidence suggests that maybe they're less distinct than we thought. We'll talk a little bit about Latin America briefly, but on this map, you can see the topic countries. So up at the top there is Mexico, right under the U.S. To its left there a little bit, or right, or to the east, you can see Cuba, and then just across the sea there, you can see Venezuela. So those are the three topic countries that we're interested in, but this is the whole of the region of Latin America. So before the late 15th century, all of what we consider Latin America today was populated by indigenous peoples, but Spain and Portugal began to colonize the southern Americas after Columbus's arrival in 1492. Spain's empire spanned the central and southern regions, while Portugal's empire kind of took up the rest. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, many countries in Latin America began to gain independence following the French and American models of revolution, where these countries said, hey, we want to be our own autonomous regions and not be under colonial rule. So that is a thing that happened.
Click resume slideshow.
Where's that?
It's a little window.
Oh, yeah. Okay, excellent. And the U.S. has a long history of interventionism in Latin America, which we'll talk about in a lot more depth in the individual countries. But generally, the U.S., since its founding, has had a lot to do with the region. Today, in sort of economic issues in modern Latin America, the U.S. share of regional trade is declining relative to its historical place in the trade of the region, whereas China's influence is rising and it continues to negotiate a bunch of commercial deals with various countries. Additionally, Japan and Russia have shown increasing economic interest in the region. So that's the kind of economic historical moment that we're at. Next, we will talk about Cuba. So here is a map of Cuba. You can see the capital city, Havana, is up there at the top. And you can also see the other countries. We'll talk a little bit briefly about Guantanamo, which is down there kind of at the bottom. And it is surrounded by the Gulf of Mexico to the north, the Bahamas to the east, the Cayman Islands and the Caribbean to the south.
Yeah.
Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there any way you can slow down just a little on the slides with a bunch of notes?
Oh, sure thing. Yeah, I can talk slower.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
No problem. I appreciate your interest in taking good notes. Do you need me to go back to anything?
Can you go back to the slide before?
We'll also make them available afterwards,
But it is good for you to have an idea of what's going on.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the basics of Cuba. It is officially called the Republic of Cuba. It is the largest nation in the Caribbean, which is the region that we just kind of looked at. So you can see the Caribbean Sea around that. There's a bunch of other stuff, but Cuba is the largest nation in that area. It has a population of about 11 million. Havana, which is the capital city that we looked at, that is in the north of the country, is the largest city by far. Not just the capital, and it is large, but all other cities kind of pale in comparison to the size of Havana, which also has the most kind of tourist activity and otherwise has the most stuff going on. Cuba has a centrally planned economy, and its top trading partner is the Netherlands. Yes?
What is this? Centrally planned economy?
It means that it is, so we'll talk about this in more depth, but for a long time Cuba has been under sort of communist rule, which means that there's a centralized government that controls everything, and especially controls kind of economic input and output, and plans how the economy runs as opposed to more of a free market system. Does that make sense? Everyone good on this slide? Cuban history. We're going to go way back to before 1492. Cuba had been populated by several groups of indigenous peoples called the Taino, the Siboney, and Guanahatabi. I did not practice pronouncing that word. But those... Say it again? I am not going to try. We're going to defer to you on all questions of pronunciation. But those are the people who lived there for a long time before the Spanish arrived. In 1492, Columbus shows up and claims the land for Spain, and Cuba then became a Spanish protectorate. Who can tell me what a protectorate means? Hands are helpful. I saw your hand first. Yeah, basically. So under the control and total rule of Spain. Can you catch? Nice. In the 1820s, other parts of the Spanish Empire in Latin America began to rebel and to become independent states under autonomous rule. But Cuba started to be called La Siempre Fidelísima Isla, or the always most faithful island, for its loyalty to the Spanish crown, so for not trying to become independent. Its reasons for staying under Spanish rule are that it was extremely dependent on Spain for trade, so it needed the flow of goods to keep coming from Spain and going to Spain in order to maintain its economy. It was also afraid of pirates, which, you know, no one wants to get hijacked by pirates, but that was a way bigger deal at the time, and slave rebellions, and it distrusted the U.S., which would be the kind of major alternative to being under Spanish rule, would probably be under the influence of the U.S., as we have also seen in history. So those are the major reasons that for that time Cuba remained under Spanish rule while other parts of the Latin America became independent. In 1868, a plantation owner named Carlos Manuel de Cespedes freed his slaves and led a rebellion that turned into what is called the 10 Years' War in order to kind of obtain autonomy. And among the people fighting are 2,000 Cuban Chinese. This is I point this out just to note that the sort of Chinese influence or people and goods coming to and from Cuba has a long history dating back to before this time. So, you know, in the fight for independence, you know, China can be considered to have played a role since its people were among those who fought for independence. In 1878, the 10 Years' War ended. Spain agreed to grant Cuba more autonomy or more control over itself. And the U.S., however, the U.S. refuses to recognize the new Cuban state, despite the agreement written by Spain or allowed by Spain. That triggers the Spanish-American War, which goes on until 1898. That ended with the Treaty of Paris, and Spain finally totally surrenders all sovereignty over Cuba, which makes it very difficult, you know, not to recognize the state. 1902, Cuba finally gains formal independence also from the U.S., but the U.S. maintains the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and to supervise finance and foreign relations, so it's still under a lot of control of the U.S. This was called the Platt Amendment, is the kind of piece of governing legislation that said that the U.S. has a lot of control and can intervene and has these particular sets of areas in which it maintains influence or maintains the ability to meddle, and that included the U.S. leasing Guantanamo Bay or renting Guantanamo Bay from Cuba. So we looked at that on the map, and who can tell me why we might be interested in that particular thing? You already answered the question. Go ahead.
Because they had the prison there, what was going on down there?
Yeah, can you say more?
Like they was torturing different inmates, like they was torturing them. It was the worst prison on earth, and to this day it's closed, but it's still there and exists, so that could be some kind of resource to use.
Okay, good. What did you want to say?
In the Latin American zone, and like because they gave up
Good, good. So it's still it continues to be a military base where we have a presence, and as I'm sorry, I don't know your name. This fellow points out we have a prison there where we keep especially prisoners of war, and there have been some high-reaching scandals that have involved kind of our treatment of prisoners there. Yeah, you want to say more?
All right, so what? I don't want.
Yeah, you don't want one? Okay.
So is it officially U.S. territory?
It's a U.S. protectorate. Sorry, Cuba is independent, but Guantanamo Bay is under sort of our control because we rent that area. So we technically own Guantanamo Bay, but the rest of Cuba we don't.
So do the laws apply to U.S. laws apply to Guantanamo?
I believe so.
Okay.
But Cuban laws don't.
Okay, so basically U.S. law, so it's American territory, and
Yes.
It's sort of like a military base. It's like
Yeah.
military base in Afghanistan. Afghani laws don't apply to U.S. forces on that military base, and it's sort of like that.
But the reason it's sort of distinct from saying just U.S. laws apply across the board is that because it's a military area, it is more governed by what the military wants than what applies to the rest of the country. Does that make sense? Yes, okay, so the Platt Amendment allows the U.S. to supervise finance and foreign relations and to intervene in Cuban affairs otherwise, and we got Guantanamo Bay. I found some pictures of some of these people that we've talked about. I don't know which is which, but in case you were wondering what these guys looked like, most of them had mustaches. So for the next 3 decades, Cuba is governed by former leaders of the War of Independence. Some modernization begins to occur, which means moving towards more kind of liberal economic reforms, more liberal political kind of systems. In 1940, free and fair national elections select Fulgencio Batista as the president, and major social reforms occur. This is a time of more modernization and liberalization, but it's still a period of corruption. The government still is not totally open or totally, going by the kind of rule of law that we would consider to be completely fair. In 1952, Batista conducts a coup to restore himself to power. So in between 1940 and 1952, he, because of term limits, he had to step down, and someone else was elected. But then he decided that he wanted to be back in power, so he conducted a coup to take back over. And then in 1958, the U.S. implements an arms embargo against Cuba and begins to support opposition to the regime. The U.S. is saying, we're not so sure that we agree with how the regime conducts itself. So any opposition we will probably support, but we won't sell arms to the government of Cuba. So in 1959, a man named Fidel Castro instigates the Cuban Revolution. This group of people kind of come over on a boat from Mexico and attempt to instigate a coup, and the government claimed to have killed everyone on that boat. But this wasn't really true because Castro and his cronies were still alive and successfully instigated the revolution. And that marks the beginning of communist rule in Cuba. The U.S. Is sort of hostile to communist rule, to Castro and his friends, and is generally just not a big fan of that set of, governmental policies, not in general into communism so much. However, the USSR does support communism, Castro, and the new Cuban regime. What does the USSR stand for?
United States and Russia. No, United States and Russia. No,
In the back?
United Soviet Socialist Republic.
No.
Nice.
It doesn't start with United.
Ununited.
Union
of Soviet States Socialist Russia.
I actually now forget, but
Wait, Google is my best friend.
There we go.
Socialist Republics. Russia.
All right, glad we collaboratively figured that out. But anyway, the point being, it's the set of states under Soviet rule, which is now Russia and a bunch of other countries, but at the time was the Soviet Union. During this time, foreign companies become nationalized. and become property of the Cuban government. And this is kind of what we were talking about earlier when we said it's a centrally planned economy, meaning that companies are not independent commercial entities but are under control of the government. Because of the sort of nationalization of the economy and centralization, is a period of no foreign investment because the Cuban economy becomes increasingly isolated and is not interested in kind of outside intervention in any form. The only trading partner that Cuba had during this time was the USSR. So in addition to political support, the Soviet Union provides much economic support and the only trade that is going on. In 1961, an event called the Bay of Pigs happened. This is an unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the government backed by the U.S. So the attempt to take down Castro and communist rule instigated by the U.S., but it's unsuccessful. In 1962, the U.S. institutes a total economic embargo prohibiting importation of Cuban goods. So Cuba can't export anything to the U.S. And sort of vice versa. And generally says, hey, Cuba, this is how strongly we feel about your country and the way you're running yourselves, that we're going to have no economic activity. So if you think of today, we have sanctions on certain countries like Iran, where we don't allow certain forms of business, but this is the strongest form of that type of policy where we say, nothing in, nothing out. The 1970s is a time of domestic discontent, poor economic growth under communist rule. Cuba also continues to boost its relationship with the USSR, its only friend during this time. However, trouble in that relationship occurs in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this is called the special period, which I think is pretty funny because it's the kind of the opposite of special for Cuba, because if your only friend is the Soviet Union and then the Soviet Union collapses and no longer functionally exists and is in, turmoil, then you're probably in trouble. And so Cuba began to have problems like food shortages, not able to, access enough capital or enough food or enough medicine because its buddy over in Eurasia is not really able to conduct business as usual. As a function of that period, in 1993, Cuba began to accept American donations of food, medicine, and cash. So the beginning of a slight easing of the embargo is a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the beginning of donations for kind of humanitarian reasons in that time. So in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, some economic liberalization occurs. So that means some of the sort of companies and industries under the rule and control of the government, bless you, open up a little bit and modernize. Cuba seeks additional trade and investment opportunities, having figured out that maybe it's not the best idea to remain totally dependent on itself and its no longer existing partner. Yes?
Who all did they start looking for trade and investment with?
So the Netherlands is an example, I said that this is a top trading partner today. So parts of Europe, it would be interested in trade and investment with the U.S. if we allowed that. Additionally, with other parts of Latin America. And the fourth bullet point there is that Cuba becomes friends with the countries under Chavez and Morales. And who can tell me which two countries those are? Yeah.
Chavez is president of Venezuela, and Morales, Mexico?
Nope, not Mexico, but here, you can have a lollipop anyway. Chavez is in charge of Venezuela, yeah. Yes, good job. Well, Chavez was in charge of Venezuela, thank you, yes. We'll get to that. What? I don't know what's going on.
Wait, who was Morales?
The president of Bolivia. So it opens up investment and trade with those countries as well as other parts of the world, but especially interested in those two countries because of access to oil and gas that it gets from those relationships. And we know that those are extremely important commodities that, allow the economy to grow and allow export and stuff like that, and generally, facilitate economic growth. It also to continue to answer your question, has an increasing relationship with China. China provides more aid and support in this time of kind of domestic humanitarian need. In 1995, that policy continues to expand as it begins to allow more foreign investment and enterprises, so foreign companies doing business in or with Cuba, which had not been allowed for the past kind of 30 years. In 1996, the U.S. passed the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, which is also known as Libertad or as Helms-Burton, the names of the sponsors of that bill. This is a huge piece of legislation that increases sanctions on the Cuban government, but allows support to the Cuban people. So you see the distinction that's being made between the top-level regime, or who's in charge of Cuba, and the Cuban people, who the U.S. sees as, you know, seeking kind of more open rule and, you know, believes to have humanitarian needs and to maybe support a democratic transition. And this act is written to be in effect until someone decides that a democratic transition is underway in Cuba. So, in other words, that when communist rule is no longer in effect, then the U.S. will, you know, go back to supporting open trade with the country. In 2008, Castro resigns as president for health reasons, and Raul, his brother, is elected as the new president. So that's really a pretty minor change if you go from the president to his brother being in charge. In 2009, the Obama administration expanded travel opportunities for people with family in Cuba. So if you have family, if you live in the U.S. but you have family or, you know, ancestors in Cuba, their travel opportunities are now more open than they were before. Also allows the value of remittances to increase. And who can tell me what remittances are? Yeah.
Like, for example, when someone in the U.S. is Cuban, someone coming back.
Exactly. So when someone living in the U.S. as an immigrant sends money back to their home country, that those are remittances. And those are a substantial portion of some countries' economies, less so Cuba than some of the other countries, but certainly, especially after the value has been increased, that's a substantial thing to have happen. 2010, that's when travel begins to expand substantially as a result of Obama changing the rules somewhat. So people can go to Cuba for a number of reasons, not just for any reason, but if you're a student, if you're a government employee, if you have kind of medical reasons or things like that, those are all reasons that you're permitted to travel to Cuba that were not in place before. However, a ton of restrictions are still in place as a function of the embargo. It's still difficult to travel, so even if you have kind of a student, if you're a student or have a government-approved reason to travel, your credit cards may not work. You may not be able to access things here that you would need, and so it's still a very difficult situation for traveling to Cuba. And the embargo substantially limits U.S. relations and economic engagement with Cuba. So we'll talk about this in more depth, but that means that uniqueness is especially strong for the AF because in the status quo right now, there is not a lot of economic engagement as a function of the embargo. So the AF is a really substantial change in current policy, or could be. Here's a depiction of the Cuban embargo. So when debating Cuba, one thing to note generally is that many changes to the regulations that limit economic engagement, that limit things like trade, can be made by the executive. So it doesn't necessarily require a legislative change because the president can kind of change the regulations on his own and say, you know, takes these backseas, it's okay for us to send like this certain form of medicine, or it's okay for people to travel for X reason without, you know, a broad piece of legislation making that change. So it is highly possible that AFs will use the executive branch to make certain changes. There's also a ton of literature because people increasingly think that the U.S. should end or at least scale back the embargo because of the negative effects that it has on trade, the negative effects on the country, things like that. However, there are many small changes because the embargo and our sanctions cover a lot of ground. There's a ton of small changes that can be made without having to defend the entirety of changing the embargo, and it's highly likely that AFs will choose to do that. rather than defending, hey, this policy that's been in place for a really long time, we're just going to wholesale cut it off. So people are more likely to choose some small component. Here's an example. The AF that you will be given licenses U.S. companies to develop Cuban offshore oil. So oil that exists off the coast of Cuba in the ocean requires drilling to get there. And allowing U.S. companies to develop that oil means that Cuban companies won't do it, but we will. So the first advantage, or the first reason why this is a good idea, is that it's good for the environment, because Cuban companies have less environmentally safe practices when drilling. The U.S. has a lot more experience drilling and is more likely to be kind of successful and to do it in a sustainable way than Cuban companies. The second reason is that it is good for Latin American relations, kind of opening up this particular economic flow between the U.S. and Cuba allows the U.S. to gain more of a foothold, especially economically, and blocks out China, and we'll talk about that in some more depth as well. And also is good for Cuba's economy to have an area of growth in its own kind of oil sector rather than being dependent on other places like Venezuela. So that's the oil AF that you will also hear and talk a bunch more about in the upcoming weeks. Does anyone still need this slide? Okay. Anyone have questions while I pause briefly? Yeah.
My question basically is that is this the reason why there was a dispute between North Korea and the U.S. or North Korea on the U.S. Recently?
I don't believe so. That is likely to have been about North Korea's nuclearization. Possible AFs under the Cuba part of the topic. So first, if you think about sort of the oil AF in reverse, if you allow Cuban oil companies to access U.S. drilling technology, that allows Cuba, rather than the U.S., to develop that offshore oil to get those resources. Not super, super different from our version of the AF, but is another possible route that teams could go. Telecommunications is, for whatever reason, a hot topic in the literature, that there's strong restrictions on telecommunications, but which changing that would allow the development of kind of the modern technology that we are used to in the U.S. in the telecommunications sector that Cuba currently does not have access to and doesn't have the ability to develop on its own. So if we allow investment into that sector or just selling the technology, those are possible forms that this could take. We could expand travel. So as we talked about, Obama has changed some of the travel restrictions and allowed more, but if you're just the average Joe in the U.S., you can't just go to Cuba because you want to sightsee. And so changing those kind of restrictions on and regulations on who can travel and when and why would allow more back and forth. Like I said, there are restrictions on things like credit cards that also make travel difficult, even if you have a reason, so that could be changed. There's a bunch of industries that we could invest in Cuba. These include biogas and ethanol production, so the production of fuels made with biogas or with ethanol that we do that a lot in the U.S. Cuba could begin to develop their industry. No-till agriculture, another example of a form of an industry that is kind of nascent or non-existent in the U.S., in Cuba, that we could invest in. Yeah, you have a question? It's just a form, so when we usually harvest crops, we use tilling machines. They're like giant machines that till the land. No-till agriculture is a more sustainable form because tilling has a lot of negative environmental effects. So it's just a different form of like harvesting crops, basically. And then the power industry, power generation and distribution, that's another industry that we could invest in. Fourth, increased cooperation on a litany of issues. So on oil, we talked about that a little bit. Science and the environment, that's a very broad category of let's develop our scientific knowledge together, or let's work on sustainable environmental practices together. What? What'd you say?
From last year, like the points of from like last year.
Oh yeah, that is that's also on the list, exactly. Disaster management, so dealing with crises like hurricanes. drug trafficking, working together to prevent drug trafficking, law enforcement, so increasing kind of general police security, as someone pointed out, port or transportation security, so, that involves fortifying our ports and, making sure that transportation is safe and secure. Anyone who debated on last year's topic is probably just dying to get back to that literature base. Cultural exchanges, that's a little bit similar to travel, but more aimed toward kind of developing our cultural ties. Military to military is one possibility, although questionable based on the evidence that we looked at earlier, whether that would be distinct from economic engagement, but arguably in any way that it facilitates economic growth or economic reform, military involvement could be topical. Provide civil society assistance, that is even more questionable whether it's economic engagement, but civil society means kind of the rule of law and having society, having democratic institutions and functions within a country, building up those things. Because Cuba has been under communist rule, it has not had a lot of the democratic institutions or functions that we consider to be modern and to be important. So building that up in that country would be civil society assistance. Bilateral investment treaty. So a treaty between the U.S. and Cuba that allows for investment under certain rules and regulations, and saying that this is the way that investment is going to occur, allows a more broad set of investment or set of investment policies. Expand visas for immigrants from Cuba, so allow people from Cuba to kind of live here under U.S. immigration law. Cuba is currently on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. We could remove it. So that's rather, most of the above are kind of positive forms of economic engagement. Removing Cuba from the list of state sponsors is kind of the reversal of a negative action. So removing restrictions, those are things that are not positive incentives, but are changes to regulations or changes to negative actions, if that makes sense. Yeah?
Can you explain bilateral investment treaty?
Yeah. So that's the idea that we would work together to build a treaty or a set of laws governing investment. So to say, here's how investment will occur. It's like we promise to do X, you promise to do Y in return, and just a set of rules and regulations, but also promises regarding how investment will occur. So we talked about how investment is very limited in the status quo. That would facilitate increased investment. Any other questions here? Yeah.
Like, as far as the no-tilling agriculture and then the drilling, could you combine that to do like an environmental ad?
Yeah, certainly. There are many possible ways to facilitate kind of cooperative, sustainable environmental practices. We're going to briefly move on from Cuba, so any last questions about that country specifically? Excellent. Mexico. So you should be familiar with where Mexico is. It's right to our south. Here's the map. The capital is Mexico City. You can see that sort of down in the southern part of the country. And take note of the Yucatan Peninsula there. That was a sort of separate in some of the colonization period. So formally, Mexico is the United Mexican States, has 31 states and a federal district. Not all that different from the way our country is set up, since we have 50 states and a federal district. Its population is 113 million, which makes it the 11th most populous country in the world. Its capital is Mexico City, as I mentioned, down in the southern part of the country. Its GDP, which is its gross domestic product, is about 1.6 trillion. So that means, the amount of money that is produced by the domestic economic activity. It is the most populous Spanish-speaking country, so has the most number of Spanish speakers. It is also home to the largest number of Native American language speakers on the continent. So among the U.S. And the rest of Latin America, most Native American language speakers. It has a major drug issue, produces lots of drugs, and a lot of drug trade moves through Mexico, which kind of makes sense geographically if you think about it, because if drugs are being produced down in to the south and all over the continent down there, and then people want to get it to the U.S., you have to go through Mexico. So drug transportation occurs in the country as well as production. And in response, the Mexico has developed war on drugs with a whole lot of activity going on there, much like the U.S. has its own war on drugs, which has its own problems. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. All right, Mexican history. So Mexico was first populated more than 13,000 years ago, and home to a bunch of indigenous civilizations, including very advanced and complex ones. Some of the most famous ones include the Olmec, the Maya, the Teotihuacan, the Toltec, and the Aztec, many of which will be familiar to you because a lot of their cultural, there's a lot of still discussion of their cultures and advanced art and things like that that we consider pretty impressive, even though a lot of it was destroyed. Spanish conquest of Mexico occurred in two parts. First was the conquest of the Aztec Empire, which was led by Hernan Cortez, that occurred between 1519 and 1521. And then I pointed out the Yucatan Peninsula. The conquest of Mayan civilization, which was largely on the Yucatan Peninsula, occurred over a much longer period of time between 1551 and 1697 in just a series of revolutions and wars and a bunch of fighting between the Spanish colonizers and the indigenous populations. In other words, between the 1500s and the early 1800s, this was a long, lengthy period of colonization during which smallpox kills many of the indigenous people, and the Spanish kill many of the people that are not killed by smallpox. And the reason that this occurs is that Europeans kind of brought smallpox with them, but because smallpox had been occurring in Europe for a while, most of those settlers or colonizers had immunity, so they weren't affected by it, but could spread it to the indigenous people, and those people died. So a really fun time to be living in Mexico as an indigenous person. In 1821, Mexico achieved independence from Spain via war, which is how independence has generally been occurring. But says no more of this. We're going to be our own place. In 1845, the U.S. annexes Texas. That means kind of takes control of and is like, sorry, I should have explained this earlier. Texas was originally part of that set of territories, but the U.S. decided that Texas would be part of the U.S. instead, and that helps to trigger the Mexican-American War, which is kind of just war over disputed territory, beginning with a massacre. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican-American War and says that Mexico has to sell its northern territories to the U.S., and the U.S. Will give citizenship to and protect the property rights of people living in those territories that Mexico has to hand over. And the U.S. will also take on a bunch of debt held by Mexico. So those are kind of the olive branches, like, well, we're taking your territory, but we'll protect your people and we'll take on some of your debt in return. Not really a great trade, but maybe, better than some other things. So the U.S. gets to keep Texas and also gets to keep California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and some parts of Wyoming and Colorado. All of that is included under the disputed territory. And you can see on this map those parts of Mexico that became part of the U.S. Under this agreement. The Gadsden Purchase occurs a couple of years later and involves the U.S. taking or buying those bottom parts of those, the bottom part in, let's see, that's New Mexico and Arizona. Yes, excellent. Okay. Between 1855 and 1862, it's a period of struggle for liberal reforms and modernization in the newly independent state. There's a war that occurs over those kinds of reform, and especially this is a period of struggle between people who believe that the state should also be not only in control of all the things that we consider government to do, but also kind of be in charge of religion. And we'll talk about that more in a second. In 1857, Constitution is written, creates the Second Federal Republic of Mexico, and does grant religious freedom. So the people who thought that people should be able to worship in their own ways and worship whatever religion they want, they kind of won out in the Constitution that's written in 1857. In the 1860s, for whatever reason, France decides to get involved in this area and is like, "Hey, we're gonna take control over this business," and so invades. But everyone is like, "France, we don't want you here." So France kind of sulked away in 1865, quietly returned to its own empire in other parts of the world. In the late 19th century, it's a time of population growth.
a time of economic growth, and a lot of this occurs with lots of trade with the U.S. There's a campaign to improve public health, so to prevent people from kind of dying really young and dying from infectious diseases and stuff like that. So generally a time of modernization. In 1910, there's a Mexican Revolution that occurs in response to elections, which were quite obviously rigged. The people say, no, we know that we all voted for one person, but you said that this other person won. So generally the populace is seeking economic and social reforms based on the idea that what's going on is not really cool and not really fair. So that's the Mexican Revolution. Goes on for a little over 10 years. In 1921, Alvaro Obregón is elected at the end of the revolution in what's considered to be a fair way. Between 1926 and 1929, this is the Cristero War, or a violent conflict over religion and its influence in the country, and over the persecution of Catholics, because like I said, when there's the decision that religion is going to be governed or dictated by the top, that means that certain religions get persecuted, get pushed to the margins, and also get sort of violently persecuted and generally treated poorly. In 1929, it is the beginning of the rule of the Industrial Revolutionary Party, also known as the PRI. Because of the Spanish language, it's the Partido Revolution. I don't remember the words because I took Spanish a long time ago. But the Industrial Revolutionary Party is abbreviated as the PRI. So if you run into PRI, it stands for that party, which had total control through the end of the 20th century. So it's the one period of one-party rule. Between 1930 and 1970, under PRI rule, what is called the El Milagro Mexicano, or the Mexican economic miracle, occurs, and that's a period of enormous economic growth based on a couple of things. One of them is education and public investment, so allowing reform and greater support for education, investment in public industries, but also on kind of becoming a more isolated economy, closing off the country to outside investments, becoming self-sufficient, or attempting to become self-sufficient, protecting domestic industries at the expense of other countries' involvement. So things like tariffs. You can tell me what a tariff is. Wacky William?
Is it tax on trade?
Yeah, sort of. Anyone more specifically? Ella?
It's a tax on goods that are imported.
Good, yeah. So it's saying, here, you can both have a lollipop. Oh, that was terrible. I'm sorry. Nice catch. Oh, that was even worse. Good job. So a tariff is when we import certain goods, but it's at a high tax, right? So if Mexico has a tariff on a particular good, such as sugar, it means that if it is imported, it is also tacked on a tax, or it costs a certain amount more than it would if you buy domestically. So that means that it's the outside industries from outside the country, or exporters, have a lot of trouble competing or getting their goods sold because it is a lot more expensive than just to buy from within the country. Domestic subsidies. Can anyone tell me what a subsidy is? Yeah, Ashley. Yeah, so more specifically, government provides support for a particular industry, so money to grow a particular crop or farm, X industry, like cow farming or whatever. So providing domestic subsidies, that's similarly to tariffs, makes competition difficult from other countries because it's protectionist. It means that we are protecting our own industries at the expense of outside countries competing. And then having quotas on export and production, meaning that there can be no more than a certain amount exported or no more than a certain amount produced. The state-owned enterprises include telecommunications, sugar, airlines, hotels, steel, and textiles. So all of those are governed and regulated exclusively by the government, not free market. Yeah?
During this time period, or?
Yes. I can't remember right now if that is still true, but certainly between 1930 and 1970, and someone can look that up if you want to. The controlled economy that is in place during this time has lots of market inefficiencies, so that produce boom and bust cycles. So that means that there will be a period of strong growth while those industries are producing a lot and doing well, but then a bust cycle kind of at the end of that period of boom where things fall off, maybe the production is not as good, or we just reach the end of the ability for growth to continue under a controlled, in a controlled environment. So between 1970 and 1994, it's a period of economic crisis, because at the end of one of these boom and bust cycles, which also typically occurred after elections, so a crisis occurs at the end of one of the boom and bust cycles because people are kind of finally fed up, and it's the inefficiencies of the economy have kind of come to a head. And did you want to say something, Hayes? Oh, okay. So because of the crisis, because of the economy doing very poorly, liberalization begins. So that means changing some of the, inefficiencies, changing some of the regulations that are keeping the economy tamped down or preventing growth that is sustainable. And so that means the reduction of trade barriers, which include the tariffs and subsidies and quotas that we just talked about. In 1994, Mexico becomes a full member of NAFTA with the U.S. and Canada, and we'll talk a bunch more about NAFTA in a minute. Yeah.
You said a full member, I don't mean to be stupid. Were they half members before?
Oh, I think that negotiations had begun, but that they hadn't actually become fully party to the treaty. And NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. So it was kind of like the U.S. and Canada were the original members of NAFTA, and they were interested in including Mexico, but Mexico didn't become party to the agreement in full until 1994. In 1995, the U.S. intervenes to prevent another economic collapse, and it does so by buying pesos on the open market, pesos being the Mexican currency, if I didn't mention that already, I can't remember, and allows loan guarantees. So that's similar to some of the other economic stuff we talked about, where a loan guarantee is saying we will give you a loan, and then we will guarantee that no matter what happens with what you're doing with that loan, that it will be covered, so that you won't lose money based on using the money from that loan. Between 1994 and 2000, President Ernesto Zedillo guides more reforms, and these are more political reforms that reduce the PRI's hold on power, and the PRI is? Good job. This is a depiction of Mexico that is more cartoony. Some basic Mexican politics. Mexico is a representative democracy and has congressional branch or legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And this is increasingly important in the modern era because it has been this way for a while, but certain parts of the government have had more control than others. So there's been times of total executive control, and the judicial and legislative branches are there to kind of ensure that that doesn't get out of control or doesn't cause harmful policies that are harmful to the country. So the checks and balances are in place in order to ensure that all three branches have equal control over the country. The National Action Party is abbreviated as PAN, and that is the second, that is a party that is right-wing and conservative. It was founded in 1939, but had no real influence during the time of the PRI having lots of control. And that the PRI that we have already identified, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or Industrial Revolutionary Party, whoops, typed that wrong, which is a center-left socialist international party. So it's part of the international set of groups who are interested in more socialist rule, so very kind of left, but with centrist influences. The Party of the Democratic Revolution, abbreviated as PRD, is a left-wing party founded in 1989, so a more recently formed as the successor of the coalition of socialist and liberal parties. So a group that is more modern, formed out of kind of this part of the left wing and this part of the left wing formed together to be the modern PRD. Yes?
How many countries are there with two major government groups?
How many countries are there with that?
Yes.
I don't know. That's a good question.
I've heard that there was one of the few. I just didn't know which other ones had it.
Oh, yeah. No, it is true that it's not all that common, but I don't know international politics enough to tell you what other countries that might be true of. Good question to research. Between 2000 and 2006, the president was Vicente Fox. And this is an interesting quirk of the Spanish language naming practices. His full name is Vicente Fox Quesada, but you mostly see him referred to as Vicente Fox, and that is because of the naming practice of the maiden name, of your father's name and your mother's name being both included, but you mostly hear the first two. And he was a member of the National Action Party between 2006 and 2012. Felipe Calderon was the president. He was also a member of the National Action Party. And in 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto was elected president. And he is a member, again, of the PRI, who was in control for a long time before, but considered to be more moderate. And also because of increasing checks and balances, the PRI being back in control is less one-party rule. So Congress, for example, is not under control of the PRI, so there's more balance between the different branches. And through all the time of political changes, a lot of what goes on is strongly connected to economic changes and whether the economy is doing well or poorly. Mexico has the 14th largest GDP in the world and is still growing rapidly. It is on track to become one of the top 10 biggest economies, or even top 5 by 2050, depending on whose predictions you're reading. It is also a period currently of major population growth. There's lots of developments underway to improve the infrastructure of the country. Mexico trades the most with the U.S. and Canada, and you can probably guess a major reason why that's the case. Excellent. So it entered a free trade agreement with the U.S. and Canada that sort of ensured that would be the case. But it also has free trade agreements with 40 other countries. They just have less, they're, weaker versions of trade agreements. So they have entered into agreements with other countries that some trade will occur, but less so than NAFTA. Remittances from the U.S. make up a huge chunk of GDP. We already talked about remittances, so that means that a lot of people living in the U.S. are sending a lot of money back to Mexico. And I believe that the actual statistic is 0.2% of GDP come from remittances, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when you consider all the things that make up gross domestic product, it is actually a really large percentage. There's also an enormous wealth gap. 46% of the population lives in poverty, and infant mortality is very high as a function of that poverty because people don't have the resources to kind of care, have maternal care and infant care required to make, have the population grow in that way. So despite the large economy, that wealth is sort of concentrated at the top. Economic reforms, often triggered by periods of crisis, have been generally sort of good for the middle class, resulting in increased wages and making capital available, but not at a rate that has allowed a strong middle class to really develop and stay and remain in the middle class. So there's not a lot of mobility within sort of the class that you're in. And the trend toward liberalization continues. So those nationalized industries, increasingly free market, and other, reduction of trade barriers and things like that, those trends are continuing. There are two sides to the coin when we talk about NAFTA. NAFTA eliminated one of the key components of NAFTA is that it eliminated a law that was meant to protect indigenous people and to protect their kind of goods and property, and that NAFTA wrote that out of existence, and that caused rebellion by the Zapatistas, who are named after Emiliano Zapatista, who was Emiliano Zapata, sorry, who was a major reform figure and rebellion figure back in the period of independence. And arguably, NAFTA caused what's called dumping, which means that the U.S., for example, or Canada, subsidizes goods such as corn, so subsidizes production of corn and then exports it really cheaply. Under the agreement, it has the right to sell it for very cheap in Mexico, and that means that Mexican farmers are kind of priced out of the market or not able to sell their corn at a price that makes it profitable. So a lot of people are kind of opposed to the effects that NAFTA has had on Mexico and its economic production. The U.S. and Mexico generally get along and have good relations. There's a major exception to that, which is the Mexican support for the Cuban government. So we already talked about kind of the U.S. is not a big fan of the Cuban government. However, Mexico supports it. So that's a thorn in the relations between the two countries. U.S.-Mexican trade, unsurprisingly, is huge. Greater than $1 billion worth of goods and 3,000 people cross the border every day. And the U.S. exports more to Mexico than to any other country except for Venezuela. So trade is generally booming. The U.S. also gives Mexico a lot of economic aid. 2008, an initiative called Merida passed, and that is designed to support efforts against drug trafficking and organized crime. And that's sort of morphed and evolved over time to generally just focus on rule of law in Mexico. So we continue to give aid under Merida to support rule of law. We also give development assistance to boost the private sector and to allow for sustainable energy development. We also have partnerships to focus first on rule of law in addition to Merida, and then also on climate change. There are a bunch of different programs in place to work with Mexico on those things. We also have IMET, which is the International Military Education and Training Program, the Non-Proliferation, Anti-Terrorism, and Related Programs, or NADR, NADR, and I can't figure out why it's called that since the letters don't actually form that particular acronym. But those are other programs that we give as assistance to Mexico. The DoD also has several programs to help with the war on drugs. So we talked about the drug problem that is considered to exist in Mexico. The DoD has instituted several programs to kind of facilitate that. The U.S. and Mexico also have a bunch of initiatives to cooperate on clean energy development and to address climate change issues. We also try to facilitate legal immigration with Mexico, but an ongoing problem has been considered to be that there is illegal immigration that also occurs. This is Obama and the current president. Who can tell me what his name is? Yeah, in the back. Good job. I haven't given you one yet, right? Oh, that was terrible. So in terms of debating this area of the topic, there are lots of forms of economic engagement now that are occurring. That's the stuff that I just talked about. So when I said that uniqueness was good for the AF on Cuba, that is different with Mexico because there's lots of economic engagement occurring now, meaning that the change that will occur under the AF is less substantial because we are already facilitating economic, engagement with Mexico. So it's less of a radical change from the status quo. This is, there are two sides to that coin because it means that the AF the uniqueness for the negative may not be as good since things similar to the AF are occurring now. On the other hand, it may be more difficult to carve out a, really meaningful advantage for the AF. The immigration is a substantial issue and will likely be relevant to many of the AFs. The advantages are less exciting than Cuba, but disads will be more difficult to find because of what I just mentioned, which is that we're doing a lot with Mexico now. There are limitations that exist now on expanded trade and economic investment, so meaning that there are barriers if we do decide to engage economically. There are some problems because there are industries that are under control of the government. Their transportation infrastructure isn't very good. There's a lot of violence because of the drug trade and the war on drugs, which means that even if we facilitate some form of investment or other engagement, companies may be reluctant to invest because they are afraid of the consequences or afraid of the ability for that investment to have, be productive or to be fruitful because, maybe you can't get around in Mexico, or maybe you're afraid that people going down there will be kind of shot in the war on drugs or something like that. Some possible Mexico AFs. One is development assistance. So some components of development assistance may be economic engagement because economic engagement is meant to boost private sector development assistance is designed to boost private sector competitiveness and promote sustainable energy development. which could be a form of economic engagement. We could treat Mexico as a special case on immigration questions. So many of you probably know that there is a bill that's being debated in Congress on the issues of immigration. We're trying to kind of overhaul the system or reform the system. And there are lots of ways to treat Mexico as kind of a special case as our major neighbor to the south. So that means giving them a temporary worker program or expanding the temporary worker program, work together with the U.S., with Mexico on border enforcement, legalize some Mexican immigrants who are living here now illegally, invest in programs to reduce illegal crossing, create a bilateral immigration agreement that sets certain conditions in place for immigration to occur, improve points of entry at the border, increase the number of visas for people from Mexico. All of those are ways that we could, facilitate immigration and facilitate legal immigration and potentially reduce illegal immigration, all of which are part of the goals of the immigration reform bill. We could also do more infrastructure development. So some of that is occurring now. We could do that some more. We could cooperate more on energy. We could cooperate on cleaning up oil spills that have occurred. We could work out disputes that have occurred in the past over the tomato and tuna trade. So basically, Mexico has brought complaints against the U.S. For unfair trading practices regarding tomatoes and tuna, for kind of protecting those industries and preventing fair competition. Mexico has said the U.S. is not doing that. We could comply with some of the regulations that are supposed to prevent that and resolve those disputes. There are negotiations ongoing for something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I don't know very much about, but to continue negotiations and resolve those, to enter fully into a Trans-Pacific Partnership is one possible path that has advocates. Facilitate secure cross-border trade to improve commerce. And then give assistance or programs for crop substitution. So that's another agricultural term where you grow a certain crop for a certain amount of time, and then you substitute and switch at a different part of the year and grow something else. That's crop substitution. It's a major agricultural development that we could facilitate. I'm going to give you a 5-minute break because my voice hurts, and then we'll talk about Venezuela and some arguments on the topic.
Feel free to go grab some water, go to the bathroom, etc. Be back here at 10:41.